Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of Lua Tutorials. All of the previous videos of Lua just kinda tackled with the problem of how we can create something with Lua, but we didn't really know of how actual mods look like. Thankfully, what happened, the game's creators released the Lua or the source code of Lua projects that contain some actual modding examples. So for example, in this case, this whole code or this whole file creates a new item called pyrokinesis, and what it does, it basically burns every enemy in the room. And I think this would be a good example of to see just how we can use the knowledge we learned in apply to actually create something cool and just something that is an actual mod that will be then visible in the game. So the first thing we see here is we create a new variable called hothead, and we use the function register mod to kind of tell the game that this is a new mod. This Lua file will basically contain a new mod, and we will name it hothead. So maybe when you're scrolling to the menus and you see this name, you know that this name actually correlates to this file. So the second line creates a new pyrokinesis item object, and because the game doesn't really know what this new item that we want to create is, we need to tell it somehow what its name is, what its properties are. So how we do is first we use this function, get item ID by name. And then we tell it what the name of this item is. And what this function then does, it goes and looks in the hothead or our mod folder, the hothead folder, it opens the content, and then it opens the items.xml file. So when this is open, we actually look at what is contained. So XMLs are kind of weird if you're not used to them, but they're really supposed to be human readable. So for that reason, they're kind of easy to get your head around once you're used to them. So first of all, we have two tags called items and /items. And this basically indicates that this is where this tag starts, and the /items indicates that this is where this tag ends. And anything in between, as indicated by the tag name items, will be our items that we want to actually create and add in the mods. So there's only one item in this scenario. Of course, if there were more, there would be multiple lines between the opening and the closing items tags. So there's a few parameters or arguments or maybe even attributes that you could say that this item has. In this scenario, the first thing we give it is its description. So this is how the item is described in the game. So this is what shows up whenever you pick it up, or maybe whenever you're swapping items or whatever. We just tell the game, so the description of this item is burn in hell. The GFX is basically the sprite of the item, so how this item would look like if we actually wanted to pick it up, how it would look like in the pedestal, or maybe how it would look in the menu if we wanted to see just what this item does. So what it does, we tell it the name of this file or where it can find it. So what then it does, it goes in the resources folder, GFX, items, collectibles, and then basically checks this name, collectibles underscore pyrokinesis.png, and compares if there's any sprite or any picture in here with the same name. And there is in this scenario, and it's called obviously the same, and this item is basically what represents our item in the game graphically. Then the next attribute is max charges, and this is basically just how many charges our item has. So some items have 6 charges, so something like Krampus's head, and of course some items have 1 charge, something like Butterbean. And in this case, this is just what we tell the game of how many charges it has. And then lastly, there's the name of our item, pyrokinesis, and this is then when it's used for when the code is actually going through whenever you want to pick it up. So in this case, when we say find this name by the item pyrokinesis, it looks through this XML file and sees that the pyrokinesis item is here. It also remembers all of these attributes, so whenever you pick it up, it will show burn in hell, or whenever maybe we put it down, we'll see this sprite show up. So at this point, we've registered our mod under the name hothead, and we also registered or created the new item called pyrokinesis item. But so far, it just has a few basic properties. It doesn't have any logic behind it. So what then happens is we also have to create a new function that will basically contain the logic of our item. So in this case, we just name this basically whatever we want, but in this case, it's hothead, use pyrokinesis. Okay, so that's fair so far. And then we go in, and the first thing we see is we create a new variable called player, and we use the object or the function isaac.getPlayer. So this might seem a bit weird, because you can see that the same thing is also applied or used here. So what this Isaac in general, is a giant object in Lua that basically has or stores all of the information about the game. So it stores our position, the enemy's position, how much damage we have, how much damage the enemies have, where they're located, on which floor we are, which rooms we are, and basically we can access that data in different ways. So in this case, if we say Isaac get player, what will happen is we'll get a reference to ourselves. So in this case, we can expect that this variable will then contain more instances of basically our stats, maybe where we're located, on which floor we are, etc. And if we say Isaac get room entities, what will happen is basically we'll get all of the entities in the room. So the entities in the room might be rocks, they might be monsters or enemies, they might be bosses, or they might be something else entirely. But this is basically, we're just splitting it up in two variables, so they're kind of easier to deal with. So what happens in the next scenario, we just loop through all of the entities in the room. So like I said, the entities are rocks, they're enemies that we shoot, they're the enemies that are invulnerable, and basically anything that is in the room that isn't us. So we just loop through that array, and we check every single element of that array. Is that entity a vulnerable enemy? So like I said, there are invulnerable enemies, there are entities which aren't enemies at all. So if you want to pass this check, basically we only want to apply burn to those enemies which will actually die from it, so the ones we can actually shoot and hurt. And we don't want to apply burns to rocks, because that wouldn't make any sense. So this is why this if statement is here, to kind of check if the enemies we want to burn are actually enemies that we can hurt. So then the next line is just, okay, if the enemies are vulnerable enemies, or the entities are vulnerable enemies, then we'll add an add burn to them. So this is yet another function that exists inside every object, inside every entity, and we basically just apply a burn to it. So what burn does is, like I said, just basically applies the burn status effect that exists inside the game that then deals damage over time to enemies. So there are a few parameters to these functions. Again, I'm not really sure what they are. It might be something like damage and seconds, and then the entity reference to the player, so basically who is dealing this damage. In this case it's us, because we have this item, but at this point we're really unaware of what this does, and when the actual DLC comes out, we'll be able to look at the documentation and see what these numbers exactly mean. But for now, they, like I said, they might be just how many seconds it takes, for how many frames it takes, or maybe how much damage we do, or anything of the sort. But at this point it's really more of a black mystery to us. But we know for sure that this is a function that adds a burning status effect to the enemy. And basically, because this loops, it checks every entity in the room and just burns everyone in the room. And this is basically our logic of this item, and this is how it works basically. So this is just self-contained, and whenever we want to use it, this is what's going to happen. So then we need to add a callback function, so to say. A callback function is a weird name because it sounds differently to what it actually is. But basically what we're telling the game is that we have a new item, and then we tell it what to do with this item. So if you just look at the code of kind of how it looks like, so first of all we tell, okay, this is a use item, so this is an active item that we press spacebar, and then something happens. But then the game is like, okay, but what happens when you press spacebar? And then we tell it, okay, this happens. We don't tell it directly of what exactly it does, we just send it a function. So you can see that hothead use pyrokinesis is basically this. So this is a function that will execute whenever we press the spacebar item. So what it does whenever we press the spacebar item, it will go through the code, it will see if the enemies are vulnerable enemies, and if they are, it will burn them. And then at last we just send the reference to the item, so the pyrokinesis item, which holds all of the necessary information so that we know how many charges it has, what its description is, etc. So this is actually just a very simple code in the sense that there's not a lot of lines. It does sound a bit confusing because there are a lot of functions that we don't really know what they do and won't really know what they do until the actual documentation for the game is released. But at this point, I hope you can see how the things we've learned in the previous videos are applied in this situation and that they're actually quite useful. And this creates just a nice little item, I think, in my opinion. And the best part is that this is the actual code that we'll be seeing. But thankfully, there's one more example which I'll go through now, and that is to do with how we can change the behavior of our enemies, so we change their AI in some way or another. Okay, so our second example is just a bit more complex, but hopefully as we go through it, it will make a bit more sense. So the first line of the code is basically to enable debugging tools, and debugging tools will just maybe show you a bit more information and will be there for the developer and to see how your code actually impacts the game. That's sometimes hard to see, and just having a way to show additional stats about the game is a good way to go about things, in my opinion. And basically, if we just deleted this line, there would be no difference, but this is probably used just so you can see what's going on whenever you're playing the game and to see how the code is actually impacted on a deeper level and maybe to get a better insight into it. So the first actual line is when we register the mod, and this is exactly the same as we did with this hothead mod. And we just say, okay, register this mod under the name pooping mod. So this is a unique name. Obviously, you can't have two mods with the same name because then the game wouldn't know which mod to pick from. Okay, then we create our logic function. So basically what our mod will do. And in this case, we just say that this is a pooping mod and it has an NPC update function. And then we just provide with an NPC. In this case, just imagine that this is Monstro, but basically this could be any other monster or any other boss in the game. So basically, enemies or bosses are in states, so they can be in an idle state, for example, which means that they're not doing anything. They could be in an attack state, which means that they are shooting something, or they can be in a jumping state, which means that they're jumping off the screen or whatever. And in this case, we check if our enemy is in an idle state, which means that he's not doing anything, and then we roll a random die from 1 to 5. And if that lands on 1, then we change his idle state to the attack state 2. And the attack state 2 is a new state we'll be actually implementing in the next part of the code. So this is basically saying there's a 20% chance that our Monstro will perform this new attack. Okay, then we check if we're actually in the state attack 2. So that means that this happens, so that 20% chance did trigger eventually. And if we are, then we do something. So in this case, we plant a poop every 5 frames. So first of all, we check when we start or when we go in this new state, the state frame is at 0. And basically what we do every frame, so the game runs at 60 frames per second, every frame this gets incremented by 1 in this line. And if that is divisible by 5, so if it is divisible by 5, so 5, 10, 15, and if you kind of imagine it, so 1 is not divisible by 5, 2 is not divisible by 5, 3, 4, 5 is divisible by 5, then we go back 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is divisible by 5. And so basically every 5 frames, so whenever the frame counter is divisible by 5, something will happen. In this situation, what we do is find the nearest position of the nearest free position from our actual position of Monstro. So we use this function called Isaac get free near position. So this is yet another global function which takes a position, so in this case it just takes the NPC's position and checks it's the first spot that's near him. So because obviously you can't spawn a poop directly on the boss or directly on Isaac or maybe on the rock or whatever, you have to check if there are any free spaces around. And basically this function just gives you back a free position near Monstro that is unoccupied by any other entity. And then at that position, which we know is free because this function always gives you a free position, we spawn a new poop. So we just spawn a new entity called poop. And there are also some other variables or parameters in here, which I'm not really sure what they are. Obviously, the pause is the position of where we spawn the poop. And this is obviously what we are spawning. But these two, 0 and false, I'm not really sure. And whether the documentation actually counts, we'll get through that and I'll try to explain it a bit better. But for now, what you need to know is that the grid spawn function basically just spawns a new poop at the first free position near Monstro, and it does this every 5 frames. Okay, then of course we increment the frame counter like I said before, and then what happens at the end, we have to get out of it eventually. And in this case we just decided that when 30 frames pass, so that's after half a second, we will actually just go back to the idle state and just reset the state frame back to 0, and then of course this can all happen again, or maybe Monstro can initiate a different attack. So in this case, after 30 frames have passed, or maybe half a second in this case, we just stop performing this poop attack. Okay, so this is our logic. So what happens is, of course, if we have a 20% chance every frame to do this new attack, and when we do this new attack, we just spawn 5 poops or a few poops around Monstro as he jumps in the air. Okay, then we register the callback. And again, this is the function that is called, or we basically tell the game on what to do. So first of all, we tell it, okay, this is not now an active item. This is an NPC update function. So we're just telling the game, okay, this function that we'll be providing you is there to update an NPC of some sort. So we're basically altering with its AI. And then we tell it which is the function that actually deals with this. And in this case, of course, again, it's pooping mod.npc update. So whenever we are basically dealing with this NPC, call this function in order to evaluate if this block of code will actually execute. And then the last one is just we say which NPC we are applying this to. So we're basically saying, okay, the entity we're applying this to is Monstro. So Monstro, basically whatever happens, whenever there will be an update function called, this callback will also call this function, and then this function will just execute whatever it executes, and then it has a 20% chance to actually perform this new attack that we implemented. Okay, so this is the end of these two examples, and hopefully you kind of gain some insight of how these things work. I hope that you see how the things we've learned in our series are applicable to the actual modding in this case. And I know that some things were kind of rushed maybe, or I didn't explain them well, but that's just because there's a lot of functions that are kind of hard to explain, because I don't really know what they do yet. So basically, when the actual modding comes, of course, I will go through these functions, I will explain them in great detail and hopefully show you how you can use them. But in this case, I just hope that they did provide you with some insight on how things work, and hopefully just give you a new appreciation for these things, and just maybe give you a better perspective of how you can use certain things we've learned when we're actually creating mods. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.